I'll let Patrick and Aaron introduce themselves. They'll be giving the talk tonight.
Thanks, Brigitte. Okay, I may even start screen sharing. And yeah, I could give my section of the talk, and Aaron, if you want, you could introduce. I'm going to be giving the first half of the talk, so Aaron could introduce himself when he goes into his section. Perfect. So yeah, well, thanks everyone for coming. This is my first talk in a very long time, so it feels really good to be doing. I'm going to be presenting this first half of the talk, which is looking at the science behind climate breakdown. I'm not a scientist myself. I'm a psychotherapist and teach mindfulness and martial arts. Also, I would say pertinently, I'm a father to 2 children, and I don't see, unfortunately, a safe future for them or anyone. So this is personal. And also just really recognizing that we're not separate in any way from the health of this planet. So I see it as our responsibility to stay informed and stay emotionally connected to what's happening as best we can. So even for me delivering this talk, or for you hearing it, it's a way to help reconnect and recognize the scientific truths that are being presented to us. Yeah, there's 2 parts to this. The first part, warning, can be a little bit heavy. This is the science, and it doesn't look good. So I would encourage you, please, to stay around until the end. The second part gets somewhat more uplifting when we look at action and what we can do. Yeah, as I say, listening to this, to give it its due, this can be heavy. You can get sometimes numbed to crazy information, but this is kind of crazy. So you really can. I've certainly had every one of these reactions, so from absolute shock, but then to that point of relief. I mean, you're all here, you all know that this is not good, this situation. So there can be a certain relief in that it is being pointed out, it is being spelled out here, and it's being addressed. So following on from that, I just want to mention this, I'm going to move this bar. Just want to mention this paper by Jen Bendel. It's excellent. It was downloaded just under 500,000 times, which really just shows the changing times, the zeitgeist. People are interested and ready for this. So in this, he explores what happens if we continue on our current trajectory, which he says, without change, leads towards climate tragedy and possible human extinction. He couldn't get this published at the university where he worked. They didn't question the content, the science in it. They questioned the emotional impact this paper might have on its readers. So that's useful to bear in mind, this sense that the information that we're receiving, it is being managed and it is being censored. And yet in this paper, Jem really touches into some of this. He questions this idea that despair is never helpful. And this idea that people, like by telling people the truth, that they would stay stuck in this state of despair. He says despair, it's an emotion like grief. This is part of what we experience when we come with a perspective that we don't know how to reckon with. And yet when we allow ourselves to feel these very painful and frightening feelings, we move through them, we grow to a state of more maturity where we have more acceptance, and we can have a more mature perspective on things. I'd say there has been a notable shift in the environmental movement in the last number of years in keeping with this. It's moved from what was maybe almost like a dogma of the past where, everything has to be said with a positive slant, some version of change your light bulbs and it'll all be fine. Don't tell people that the house is on fire because it'll upset them and then they'll be depressed and won't do anything. But it's quite clear people, by and large, we weren't acting anyway. So let's include an appropriate amount of fear. Fear is a part of the picture. And I think that's part of what's actually woken up this great swell within the climate movement of actually people recognizing that this affects them, that this is personal. I'd also say myself, I know when I did reckon with this, even a couple of years ago, I did feel quite a lot of shock and grief. And I still do feel grief at times. And when I do, that feels healthy to me. That feels connected to, but I also feel like a huge sense of love for life on this planet, a real sense of how nothing is separate. And also, I probably feel less hope for the future, but I would say I feel a greater sense of purpose. And I think a lot of people who engage, that's very common to a lot of people who engage with this work. You know, there's this desire, like, and also feel a lot of support with that, the community of XOR, being with people who've actually looked at some of these difficult truths and decided how they want to act. This desire to be a worthy ancestor. And this is quite a shift, and probably quite a liberating one, from this kind of more narcissistic culture of how do we look after privilege for ourselves and for our family, and more about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do without a sense of attachment to outcome, or at least working with that principle. Now, slides work. Okay, something to hold in mind for this talk, this idea of the precautionary principle. This is basically saying, even if we don't fully understand how something is going to work, if there's enough evidence that something looks really bad and that the effects of this happening would be catastrophic, then we should avoid it at all costs. So this precautionary principle, it's there in most areas of public life, health and safety, it's everywhere, it makes common sense. However, in particular in this first part of the talk, I want to show that we're completely neglecting this principle when it comes to climate and environment. So even if some of the data in time changes and we can't be 100% sure of everything, there's enough evidence for us to take a lot more care than we are. Giving a little history to our awareness of this, going back into 92, 1,700 scientists signed first warning to humanity. Fast forward 20 years, and we had a scientist's second warning to humanity. 20,000 scientists signing. That's a huge collaboration. They said widespread action must be taken to avoid, action must be taken to avoid widespread misery and catastrophic biodiversity loss. Soon it'll be too late to shift away from our failing trajectory, and time is running out. We must recognize in our day-to-day lives and in our governing institutions that Earth, with all its life, is our only home. To get 20,000 scientists saying that, you would kind of hope that this would reach people and that this would be in the news long enough for us to connect with it. But of course it doesn't, and that's why we're here. To put a familiar face, this is David Attenborough, not a politician or pushing an agenda, but he's an expert on the natural world. And he says, just like the scientists, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale, greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of the natural world is on the horizon. He's also made a great documentary, or mostly great, I have issues with some of it, and that's on Netflix, I think, so that's worth watching to help us stay connected again to things that we don't always see. To give you a few definitions, climate change, this is about global temperature basically, and how this has been steadily rising since we started emitting carbon on a mass scale since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Up to this point, the climate had been mostly stable for thousands of years. The IPCC, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, so this is a UN body of thousands of scientists from around the world actively researching climate change. So they met in '88 when the governments the world first recognized there was a major problem. Since they've been meeting and working on it, we have to recognize carbon has gone up 60% in the atmosphere. So we are not only are we not tackling it, it's escalating. And they said we had back in 2018, they said we have a 12-year window to actually to have a chance to try to affect change within this, or at least that's our best opportunity. After that, it gets dramatically harder. The Paris Agreement, this was in 2015. Governments of the world met in Paris and they came up with policies to how we should reduce carbon emissions so the temperature stays within 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees, because there's scientific consensus that says if the temperature can be capped at 1.5 degrees, then the worst effects of climate change could be avoided. At 2 degrees, the effects would still be catastrophic, but possibly not an existential risk to humanity. I should also say you don't have to remember all these details. it's more important to get the sense of it, get the flavor. Any of this you choose to research after when the information's available. So yeah, it's more important to actually really connect emotionally with what this means. So you could say 1.5 or 2 degrees doesn't sound like a whole lot, but the point is that to have that happen, you have huge fluctuations on either end of that. So for instance, in the Arctic, I think this was last year, Arctic heat wave. So there was 38 degrees in Siberia, which is crazy. That's 18 degrees warmer than the maximum daily temperature for there. You have what's called polar amplification. So a degree of warming in the rest of global warming in the rest of the world can be 2 to 3 degrees in the Arctic. Looking at the Arctic, these are trend lines mapped onto the decline of the Arctic sea ice, and they're pretty clear the direction which it's going. We can't say exactly when, but soon we're going to hit a point where the Arctic is essentially free of ice in the summer. And this is one of a very, very worrying feedback loop. So this is called the albedo effect. If you think of it, white ice reflects the sunlight back, where when that melts, you're left with a dark sea, which absorbs the heat a lot more, which melts the ice, and you get a vicious cycle, which arguably at a certain point, that tipping point, it may be too late to actually reverse that mechanism. Also, we know nothing happens in isolation. So you have, instead of feedback loops, you have feedback cascades where one feedback loop connects in with another feedback loop. So this was the Hothouse Earth paper in 2018, which was a really good year for scientific exploration of climate change. It was when the IPCC report came out, which was a big one. But this paper looked at 10 of these feedback loops and how they actually can all interact. So from the albedo effect also to deforestation, to the thawing of the permafrost, and all the massive amounts of methane, which is an extremely potent greenhouse gas that's contained underneath it. And they looked at how this can interact, and they said that even at just 2 degrees, the Earth can flip into a hothouse Earth and stay there. So, I mean, so this is really worrying. This shows that, you know, the target has to be 1.5 degrees, not 2 degrees. And even 1.5 was never a good idea. Just looking at the temperature rise since industrial times, there's a paper by University of Washington which analyzed our chances of trying to hit these targets. It says we have a 1% chance of hitting 1.5. So that should be news to the world, and that should be terrifying. It says we have a 5% chance of hitting 2 degrees, and the likely range between being 2 and 5. So let's say 3. At 3 degrees, you have horrendous consequences. We're already having horrendous consequences at the temperature we're at. So at 3 degrees, you're looking at the Amazon burning and becoming a producer of carbon rather than the carbon sink that it currently is. You're looking at major crop failures and flooding, heat waves, and so on. The type of things we are seeing today, we are already, a lot of these tipping points have been activated. So this is, you know, not this, like if you look, this was Australia, this was crazy. It was like 3 billion animals killed or harmed. I mean, if we look at California, even last year, we had the world's first gigafire in modern history. Gigafire is 4 million acres of fire, which was described as mind-boggling by the California Fire Department. The Australian Commission, their opening words are, "This is not normal." The 10 hottest year on global records have been since 2009. So this is, again, just really highlighting the sense that this is so far from normal, and yet the alarm isn't working. Bringing this a little bit closer to home in the Arctic. So like even in Ireland in a moderate climate, this was a couple of years ago, we had a huge temperature. It was 32 degrees. This just showing the Vartry Reservoir in Wicklow. So like from July, where there's plenty of water, to September. So our resources, they can only cope with so much extremes, and then we hit into serious issues. It's obviously not just in one direction. It's not all about heat, it's about extremes. So February last year was the wettest ever. And this has huge impacts again on businesses, on homes, and also not just water damage, but contamination, sewage, chemicals, fire effluent. Yeah, looking at sea level rise. Depending on, so this is, again, these are models predicting based on the data we have. And it depends on how well we manage the current threats and situations we're facing. So if we deal with it extremely well, looking at 0.3 of a meter rise, look at it badly, you're talking about 2.5 meters of sea level rise. So, and this is by the end of the century. This will mean many areas of the world just becoming uninhabitable. So London, New York, even in Ireland, 2 million people live within 5 kilometers of the coast, which leads on to the greatest migration and movement of people that the world has ever seen. So the World Bank, fairly conservative, the World Bank estimates 140 million people on the move by 2050. Other studies say up to 1 billion. We can estimate maybe 300 million. So that's by 2050. My kids will be around about my age at that point. And society just can't cope with that and can't cope with the many associated pressures that come with that. There are other pressures as well, not just climate change and global heating. So there's just the direct impact on land and on biodiversity. If we look at agriculture and the intensive systems we've been using to support 7 billion humans and our increasing appetite for high meat and dairy. So this is having absolute just destructive effects on biodiversity. Also, I mean, our reliance on pesticides, herbicides, and use of synthetic fertilizers. So it's decimating whole ecosystems and pollinators. If you look within Ireland, we have David Wall from Teagasc said in just over 10 years, we had lost 40% of soil fertility in just over 10 years. So if we continue on that trajectory, it's not long before we have serious difficulties growing food. There's obviously a huge deforestation globally as well. Vast areas of rainforest cleared for palm oil production, which in Ireland we like to mix that palm oil with our dried milk powder from the dairy herd and export that as formula to China. So we're all part of this system. Also deforestation to do with beef, just for beef. So again, this is the forests become not a store of carbon, but an actual producer. The ocean, which we rarely see the impacts, it's not in front of us, but the oceans have been soaking up a huge amount of this global heating. The oceans are actually the lungs of the earth more so than the forests, but that's dependent on a thriving ecosystem, which is breaking down, having huge levels of ocean acidification, coral bleaching, overfishing. So, and again, we don't see this. The IPBES report, this was this maybe 2 years ago, a year or two ago. So this was massive collaboration of scientists. This was the biggest report ever drawn up on nature. This is like the IPCC regarding nature and biodiversity. And it just says what we already know, but it offers a really credible authority that natural systems are breaking down at an alarming rate. It says over 100 million species are threatened with extinction. So that's just over, like that's about a quarter of life on this planet. You know, I think when we hear numbers like this, we're in an age of media overwhelm. It's, you know, things are clickbait. They're trying to grab our attention for a while. This isn't clickbait. This is the best science we have. Also want to, someone gave an example. I don't want to trivialize with this, but the example struck me how difficult it is to connect with numbers. He said, if I heard of one dog whose tail got stood on, I'd like feel sad. I'd go, oh, poor dog. But if I hear 10 dogs, already it's abstract and it's harder to connect with. And yet that is suffering. A quarter of life threatened with extinction, that is suffering. And you know, it's our job to try to get past our own defense mechanisms and emotionally connect with this. In XOR, we say, you know, tell the truth and act as if the truth matters. That's what we owe to the next generation. and to this life that we're part of. You could say, it all sounds terrible. Why are we talking about extinction? We know there have been 5 major mass extinctions before. The last one, the Permian, resulted in 96% of all life on the planet dying off. A runaway cascade of feedback loops, gassing of the planet with hydrogen sulfide. So, and we are pumping CO2 into the atmosphere at a rate that mirrors the Permian. So we do know human extinction is a possibility, and we know the mechanism that can happen by. Aside from future extinction, we are currently in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. So there's so many stats you could pull out. One that is striking: in Germany, a study in 2017 said 3/4 of flying insects vanished in 25 years. So since the time I was 20, I'm now 45, I think, 3/4 of all flying insects gone. So, and also you could even just look at 4% of animals are actually wild animals. The rest are human and livestock. We've that radically altered the fabric of life. You know, we teach kids about like a world with rhinos and lions, but it's actually cow, 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 pig, 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 and chickens as far as you can stretch someone's attention for. We don't know the impact of the loss of any given species, but biodiversity is the strength of life, the web of life. The more we lose, the more things start to unravel, and we have unknown effects. So we don't live in isolation from these species or ecosystems. Everything is dependent and interconnected. So again, we just hit effects that we wouldn't have expected. Looking at one of these effects, one that everyone's familiar with at the moment, COVID-19. And looking at some of the things that give rise to diseases transferring from animals to humans: deforestation, intensified agriculture and livestock production, illegally, poorly regulated wildlife trade, climate change. So by altering the environment at a faster rate than at any other moment in history, the scientists say humans, we've created the chance for viruses to evolve. And yet, it's worth noting, just as we're speaking about coronavirus, that this was last year was the first year since industrial age where there's actually a drop in emissions. So we've always said, you can't do it, you can't stop the economy, we can't change, we can. Albeit it only has the temperature, the emissions have dropped by 4 to 7%, so not enough. And for 1 year, if this is 1 year, that's going to make not a hair's difference. And also a lot of these temperatures are also locked in by those feedback mechanisms. But again, it's showing what it's showing. Also to note when some of the impacts of this. So this is Milan, photos from January and April of the same year. So massive change in air pollution, which kills so many people. And I think, what did they say in Milan? They said they're actually planning, or we're thinking about introducing a plan to reduce car use after the pandemic to avoid a rebound. So you saw photos around the world, and people got a sense of how nature was recovering. I saw like a fox at the Liffey, and people could hear the birds and really get that sense of, again, wow, nature starting to come closer. And yet within this, as in everything, there's huge inequality. So with COVID-19, the pain is being shared unequally across society. People suffering more than others, and equally even in terms of many businesses obviously have gone under. But yet billionaires' wealth rises to 10.2 trillion. So some people are doing exceedingly well in this. So the climate crisis shows a similar injustice. People in the South are unfairly facing the consequences of the consumerist lifestyles of the North. So going back to business cannot and should not be an option, because we know that inequality, this is one of the causative factors for why we are in this crisis. So there's a lot more you could and should say about this issue of justice, but basically, for us to bring about lasting change, it has to be socially fair. We have to bring everyone on board and recognize we are all of one life. So otherwise we end up with some form of eco-fascism. Looking at how disruptive this has been, XR tries to disrupt, but if we look at the disruption in our lives of COVID, climate change, it's already destructing people's lives massively, but the bigger waves are on their way. And speaking of some of that disruption, I want to return to this paper. Yeah, I want to read something, and some of this is designed to help us connect and move away from that abstract, but yet it can impact on us because it can be frightening stuff. So I just want to take a moment to breathe and connect before. Okay, one part in this paper, he says, it's a truism we do not know what the future will be. We can see trends, though. We might pray for time, but the evidence before us suggests we're set for disruptive and uncontrollable levels of climate change, bringing starvation, destruction, migration, disease, and war. The evidence is mounting that impacts will be catastrophic to our livelihoods and the societies we live within. Our norms of behavior, that which we call civilization, may also degrade. When we contemplate this possibility, it can seem abstract. The words I ended the previous paragraph may seem subconsciously, at least, to be describing a situation to feel sorry about, as we witness scenes on TV or online. But when I say starvation, destruction, migration, disease, and war, I mean in your life. With the power down, soon you wouldn't have water coming out of your tap. You'll depend on your neighbors for food and some warmth. You'll become malnourished. You won't know whether to stay or go. You'll fear being violently killed before starving to death. These descriptions may seem overly dramatic, and some readers might consider them an unacademic form of writing, which would be an interesting comment on why we even write at all. The words I chose above are an attempt to cut through the sense that this topic is purely theoretical. Sometimes in Exo talks, we read something from the famine, and this is actually to take this to heart, that it's our job to kind of join the dots, do some of that emotional work of recognizing what this is already meaning in people's lives and the impact that this will happen. Although the uncertainty, we don't know in what way. I don't want to be overly prescriptive. So coming towards the end, I just want to say that while this is dire, you could be wondering why, if it's as bad as this, why aren't we getting told of this more in the media? And why don't people know this? Two things to consider are, one is denial, and the other is crisis fatigues. But people do know. So this is a quote from Douglas Rushkoff. He was invited to speak to a group of billionaires, the 1%, and he says, last year I got invited to a super deluxe private resort to deliver a keynote speech on what I assume would be 100 or so investment bankers, the most he'd ever been, biggest fee he'd ever been offered. 5 super wealthy guys from the upper echelon of the hedge fund world. After a bit of small talk, I realized they'd no interest in the information he'd prepared about the future of technology. They'd come with questions of their own. Which region will be most impacted by the coming climate crisis, New Zealand or Alaska? Finally, the CEO of the brokerage house explained he nearly completed building his own underground bunker system, and his question is, how do I maintain authority over my security force after the event? And this question occupied them for the rest of the hour. The new guards would be required to protect their compounds from angry mobs, but how would they pay them when money was worthless? Would the guards choose their own leader? Should they use combination locks or disciplinary collars? So essentially this phrase, the event, is the term the elite are given to the breakdown of society that they are anticipating. And apparently it's talked a lot in elite circles, survival of the richest. So things are speeding up rapidly. Animals, insects, plant life disappearing, planetary resources are consumed at an exponential rate. So this is a very short video by David Suzuki. He explains in very plain English the nature of exponential growth. He's a lovely talk on YouTube called Why We Need to Think About Human Extinction. And it's not as depressing as it sounds. It has that punch in it, but he's also got a beautiful heart and he's very alive. So I'm gonna, hopefully this will play about 3 minutes.
Our home, the biosphere, is finite and fixed. It can't grow. And if the economy is a part of and utterly dependent on the biosphere, the attempt to maintain endless growth is an impossibility. Let me show you why. Steady growth over time, whether it's the amount of garbage you make, the size of your city, the population of the world, anything growing steadily is called exponential growth. And anything growing exponentially has a predictable doubling time. I am going to give you a system analogous to the planet. It's a test tube full of food for bacteria. So the test tube and food is the planet, and the bacteria are us. I'm going to add one bacterial cell to the test tube, and it's going to begin to divide every minute. That's exponential growth. So at the beginning, there's one cell. 1 minute, there are two. 2 minutes, there are 4. 3 minutes, there are 8. That's exponential growth. And at 60 minutes, the test tube is completely packed with bacteria, and there's no food left. So we have a 60-minute growth cycle. When is the test tube half full? And of course, the answer is at 59 minutes. 59 minutes, it's only half full, but 1 minute later, it's completely full. So at 58 minutes, it's 25% full. 57 minutes, it's 12.5% full. At 55 minutes of a 60-minute cycle, it's 3% full. So let's suppose at 55 minutes, one of the bacteria says, hey guys, I've been thinking we got a population problem. The other bacteria would say, Jack, what the hell have you been smoking? 97% of the test tube's empty and we've been around for 55 minutes. They'd be 5 minutes away from filling. So bacteria are no smarter than people. At 59 minutes they go, oh my God, Jack is right. We got 1 minute left. What are we going to do now? Well, we better give that money to those scientists. Maybe they can pull us out of this. But the world for the bacteria is a test tube and food. How can they possibly add any more food or space to that world? They can't. They can no more add food or space than we can add air, water, soil, or biodiversity to the biosphere. This is not speculation or hypothesis. It is straight mathematical certainty. And every scientist I have talked to agrees with me. We're already past the 59th minute. So all the demand for relentless growth is a call to accelerate down what is a suicidal path. And by focusing on growth, we fail to ask the important questions, like how much is enough? Are there no limits? Are we happier with all this stuff? What is an economy for? We never ask those questions.
Okay. He's very clear. I don't know who put that music in, but so coming to an end, I want to actually just read a quote. This is Kate Marvel from the NASA Goddard Institute. So I want to end with speaking about attitude, because this is something that is somewhat within our control. We can attune ourselves towards helpful attitudes, which I think is like courage and acceptance. So she says, we need courage, not hope. Courage is the resolve to do the right thing without the assurance of a happy ending. We're inevitably sending our children to live on an unfamiliar planet. But the opposite of hope is not despair, it's grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage we can mourn. And here the sheer scale of the problem provides a perverse comfort. We're in this together. The swiftness of change, scale and inevitability binds us into one. Broken hearts, trapped under a warming atmosphere. We need courage, not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We're all fated to live lives shot through with sadness, and they're not worth less for it. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. This brings me to the end of my section. We're going to, actually, I just want to sit even just for a few moments in silence, just to allow some of this to sink in and allow us to connect with where we're at. And the challenge isn't to understand every fact presented here, it's to come up with an appropriate emotional response. And some of that is just checking in with exactly how we find ourselves right now. So we'll sit for even 20 seconds. Thank you. I'll hand over to Brigitte. Thanks, everyone.
So I'm going to let Louis take the floor. And again, if you have questions, I'm going to have Aaron take the floor. And if you have questions, you can message them to myself or Louis, and we'll have time to ask them at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Brigitte. Louis trying to do me out of the good side of the talk, the inspiring bit. Great. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. My own background is I've grown up in Cloughjordan Ecovillage, so I've been around this media, this awareness for quite a long time. I've been working with the NGO sector mainly, with Cultivate, Living and Learning, working across the small but very well networked sustainability network in Ireland. So my journey into activism began about 4 or 5 years ago, starting with Amnesty International, but Extinction Rebellion has become my prime focus in the activism world over the last 2.5 years. So thank you everyone for coming. I will just start screen sharing. Yeah, everyone see that? Great. So this section, we will begin to look at what we can actually do about this, what we can do collectively, individually. This is heavy material, you know. I hope that you would taking this information as real, moves you. I know in my own life it has been a huge catalyst, and as Patrick mentioned at the beginning, we can have a number of emotional reactions. Hearing the first half of the talk again for me, it's familiar information, but I actually was connecting most with a sense of relief, because the last few years have felt like a real way to channel this feeling moved like this into meaningful action with a large group of people around the world who share the same drive. So I hope it can also be a catalyst to you. So what does it mean for us to take individual action? We're very familiar with the cliche responses: recycling, saving power, flying less, eating less meat, turning off the lights. These are good things. I don't advise you to go against those recommendations, but it's practically having our head in the sand in relation to the magnitude of what we're facing. There is no way to have effective individual response that is going to achieve the system change that we're actually looking for on the scale that we need. Some collective responses, however, though, are fantastic. You know, the UN, this slide is new actually, it just got released today. I haven't read it yet, but the UN released this Making Peace with Nature, what's been called the scientific blueprint to tackle the climate, biodiversity and pollution emergencies. There are solutions out there. There are so many solutions. You know, in Ecovillage, we're trying our best to pilot some of these to be an example. There's community supported agriculture. There's a micro generation of your own electricity that can support back to the grid, which some of the environmental network is actually working on now. We have solutions, but unfortunately, we do not have the means to implement these on the scale that's needed, and funding is not being channeled into that. So also, it's not enough to just look at solutions. We can see it with the political response that there's been definitely steps in the right direction. So back in 2019, the UK government declared the first climate and biodiversity emergency ever. Ireland followed closely by in the weeks that passed. This was an unusual circumstance, though, as only a handful of TDs actually showed up in the Dáil here in Ireland. The amendment was proposed by Fianna Fáil, but no representatives of the main parties were present. Leo Varadkar then called it symbolic. And in the hours that followed, Richard Bruton has spoke of continuing fossil fuel exploration as a transition to decarbonisation, because we are not in a position to talk about ceasing fossil fuel exploration. So the announcement that it's emergency has been made, but how we actually see this being put into practice within our political sphere is worrying, for lack of other words. So some of those steps, the Climate Action Plan was launched in 2019. This plan, though, only envisaged a 2% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions every year until 2030, which is in contrast to the 7.6% reduction minimum that the UN has announced. So this plan was not even on track to reach that. And there was a lot of criticism at the time, and the recent plan mentioned 7% annual reductions, which is a hell of a lot better, but obviously is actually still below the minimum. There are going to be some updates to the recent plan coming out soon at the end of February. The date keeps changing, but I would advise you to wait and see what updates are being proposed. XR will keep a voice on it, we'll keep following it, and on social media you'll be able to track what collectively is our response, and hopefully we'll see some really valuable targets. Looking at the legal response, Friends of the Irish Environment took the government to court in early January 19. They won. Their case was heard, and it was a monumental success. It was one of the first of its kind. It was the first in Ireland, and it was the second case in the world in which the highest national court of law required a government to revise its national climate policy in light of its legal obligations. So the legal response we can take do have weight. They are worthy of pursuing. This was a great victory. But as Patrick has covered, there are lots of little successes, but they're not working. Climate emissions are still rising. And why haven't these things worked? Well, primarily it's just lack of political will. I mean, we've seen this with COVID as well, that when the will is there to change, when we actually perceive something as a drastic emergency, we can change. And that is what we need, frankly, to tackle this. It's a state of emergency. We need to actually, we've declared climate and biodiversity emergency, but to take this on board and react with the transformative actions we need is a completely different ballgame. So looking at history, there's been many examples we can look at. The Second World War, for instance, economies were transformed virtually overnight. In 1943, just half of national expenditure was devoted directly to war. So between 1939 and 42, imports of animal feeds fell by 94%, imports of butter fell by 69%, sugar by 66%. So people's lives changed radically. The priorities shifted from business as usual, our way of life, our peaceful way of life, to trying to cope with catastrophic emergency. So there was a complete collapse in the production of consumer industries, and overnight car manufacturing turned to tank manufacturing. So, you know, we're definitely not seeing weapon creation as the way we want the economy to go, but it can be completely revolutionized. Been done before. So talking about the social response to this and ethics, when you know that your government is not doing enough and is actively driving extinction events, what do we do as a people? In XR, we really have seen this as the duty of the people to put a stop to this. And the reality is that governments of the world are going to be complicit in the destruction of the planet unless they form some kind of transformational policies that actually redirect the focus of the economy and focus away from GDP and start actually implementing the kind of changes that we need. So we need a new approach. Now, I'd just like to say a little bit about some of the conventional approaches. Like, obviously there is legal potential. There is amazing things we can do by petitions, by marching, by leafleting, by meeting our TDs. These methods all are appropriate for relative political issues, and Extinction Rebellion members and the rest of the environmental network have done some amazing efforts. One Future last year, Stop Climate Chaos. Stop Climate Chaos actually recently had over 1,000 people online meeting their TDs. Like, collective efforts are having successes, but these are relative successes, and change will come from a diversity of approaches, and the role that we are seeing now is nothing short of rebellion. So when I say rebellion, it's founded in absolute non-violence, using direct action. We've seen examples throughout history, people that did not have the state on their side when the movement began. As the time went on, the people supported them, and they are now seen as they're now seen as heroes in history. Civil resistance, civil disobedience, or nonviolent direct action, NVDA, means normally law-abiding citizens breaking rules and laws as a way to force change in a system that is refusing to change. So we're well familiar with the amazing work that these people did. They changed the face of the planet, they changed the face of history forevermore for the better. Think of the universal vote, women's suffrage, gay marriage rights, racial discrimination, liberty from colonial rule even. As a group, we can partake in civil disobedience, and the state, the opponents, the oppressive regimes tend to respond with some kind of further repression, like arresting people, sending them to jail, taking away rights, silencing. Ultimately though, this can be used it can be used against them, as it makes them look over the top and generally authoritarian to the public who are more likely to join. But really what we're talking about here is respect. Opponents are not seen as the enemy, they're not seen as opposition, they're treated with respect. And non-violence is both morally right and far more effective at building widespread support than any call to arms. It embodies the kind of change that we want to see in the world. And in order to achieve change, the movement must be able to generate leverage. The bigger the movement, the more leverage it can generate because it's got more of society getting involved. The diversity is crucial. So the more people that actually take part, then the more skills that are within the movement, the more lawyers, scientists, lecturers, ex-police officers, artists, the more of a cross-section of society you actually get joining the call. And the more diverse it is, the more it actually represents the population, and the more likely you are to succeed by being supported by wider society. So NVDA mobilization has been the way that we have been rebelling so far. It's disruptive, it's a key part of the strategy. Our instincts as good citizens are to obey the laws, but we need to break them in a way in order to actually be disruptive. So that means being in the capital, being in the center of power where decision makers will notice you, and causing enough disruption that your message is heard. It can't just be one march though, it can't just be one event. It has to be prolonged. That's why, as part of our strategy, we have held week-long demonstrations where we keep coming back to let them know that this message is being held really, really urgently and to heart by so many people. Because change won't occur overnight. We need to sustain momentum, and the movement needs to be resilient, or it will dissipate over time. Like Occupy was the same. It did amazing work, but it didn't sustain. We need lasting momentum. So although we do need public awareness, our tactics have changed a little bit from targeting the public. Obviously, the more people that talk about this, the more it becomes part of public awareness, the more it gets the message out. But disrupting the public ultimately is not the aim. However, we can see that in Ireland's own context, NVDA has had great impact looking at the water charges. You know, people boycotted these. The government had a very strong drive for it. It was supported by finance from Europe, but ultimately people said no, they wouldn't pay them, and the water charges were scrapped. Different act of rebellion. But no doubt that both left and right sides, there have been ways to justify rebellion that the left and right have seen. You know, I think the water charges brought everyone together. So other ways that we've seen mobilization recently. September 2019, the Global Week for Future. 4,500 strikes happened across 150 countries. This was largely the largest climate strike in world history. Those gatherings gathered about 4 million protesters. Many of them were school children, sparked by Greta Thunberg. So already we're starting to see some kind of impression changing. This is called the Overton window, where there's a new idea that's proposed. It's unthinkable initially, and over time, as it becomes more normalized, both through the media attention, both through public awareness, both through conversations, it becomes more and more acceptable and eventually can become policy. We've seen this looking back at the likes of slavery, the divine right of kings, things that to us now are completely unthinkable. But at the time, this was normal. But then as society changed, as those values shifted, those things became outlawed and it became policy, it became illegal. Even looking at Ireland in the last 50 years, divorce, gay marriage, abortion, they would have all been unthinkable 50 years ago. Today, they're policy. So what can happen is people say, well, I agree with you, but I don't like the way you're going about it. You know, that's fine. We won't get everyone on board using the same methods. But the point is they are now actually talking about this. That is still shifting the window. And we have started to see that window shifting quite a good bit. Absolutely, the declaration of climate and biodiversity emergencies was unthinkable. It seemed like a really far off goal 3-4 years ago. It's happened now 65 times since it's happened first in the UK. It's a domino effect. Even the language we've started using around climate change has changed. It's no longer change. We speak about climate breakdown, climate catastrophe, climate emergency. It's escalating. We're taking this to heart. So a little bit about who we are, Extinction Rebellion Ireland. The movement started in the UK in late 2018. It kind of surfed the wave that the IPCC report came out on, the same as Greta and the school strikes. That time particularly was really rich for kind of a global awakening towards the kind of action that we need. So Extinction Rebellion has now spread to 78 countries across the world with nearly 1,200 regional groups. This is amazing, and it's been extraordinary to watch. Myself and some others in the network, Patrick as well, and Louis, we saw the initial call go out in Ireland and we were in a position to be able to get involved. And within that time, we've just seen things transform. Now, we have been a bit quieter lately. I'll speak about that a little bit later. COVID really disrupted us along with everyone else, despite us ironically being all about disruption. But yeah, the movement is global and it's all been grassroots. So we recognize that people who in the global south who've produced the least amount of carbon have been suffering some of the worst effects, which is why we've been working with the Internationalist Solidarity Network to support the global south to bring important issues coming from their voice. And some of the strategy that's happening now globally is to have a global citizens assembly to make recommendations on how we can best support the global south, how we can avert the worst impacts to make sure that those who are already vulnerable will not suffer even more. So us as a movement, we have 3 demands. The first is that government and media adequately inform the public of the climate and biodiversity emergency, communicating the urgency for change and the consequences of not doing so. That's telling the truth. That's the kind of heart that we try and bring this talk to people with. It's harrowing, it's tough info, it's heavy. It is what we see as really necessary to actually be adequately informed. If the public aren't informed, they cannot act on it. They can't see the reason for government needing to make radical change. The government and media are the biggest source of information for most people. And we've seen this with COVID. If that kind of information was not given with such urgency every day, people wouldn't be able to deal with it. They wouldn't be able to respond in an appropriate way. Our second demand, act like it's an emergency, fairly self-explanatory. Now that we've announced a climate and biodiversity emergency, how do we actually act like that? How do we put that into practice? But it means that we actually need to reverse any policies that are not in alignment with reducing carbon emissions to net zero by 2030. And we know now that that's kind of a scale, that level of transformation, that level of urgency is very possible if the will is there. The third demand, as I mentioned there with the Global Solidarity Network, is a just transition, that we are not just implementing these changes in the West, in developed countries, that this is a global context that needs to be made. It needs to be a just transition, just for everyone. We have 10 demands, we have 10 principles, 10 values that are the core of the movement. To me, this is a huge part of the heart of it. Anyone that agrees, that adopts these 10 principles can act in the name of XR. This means that it's completely autonomous, it's decentralized, there's no holding of power. It's a grassroots movement that can spread at the rate that it has. I won't get into all of these as we won't quite have time, but to highlight a few of them. Number 3, we need a regenerative culture. So obviously the system that we're in is toxic, it's difficult in its own sense. We need to actually live with the kind of culture that we want to see in the world, which means that we really try and connect emotionally to what's going on for us as activists. We try and support each other. We take breaks to avoid burnout. Really, this movement has a lot of heart and friendship, and I think that's been one of the strengths to it. We openly challenge ourselves and our toxic system, number 4. So it's the system that has the problems. And this links in with number 8, we avoid blaming and shaming. Individuals play a part in it. Individuals can make choices. We can, as I said, individual choices are valuable, but they're not the answer. So we avoid blaming and shaming individuals because they are not the problem. It's a toxic system. We welcome everyone and every part of everyone. This has always been open. We challenge behaviors, again, not individuals. And we're completely based on learning and mitigating for power. Having said that, humans are humans. We have to deal with many of the problems that you do in the rest of society, but there is a really strong commitment to change, to kindness, to working together. So to say a little bit about what we've actually done in the last 2 years, this was early 2019, shortly before the emergencies were declared. This was O'Connell Bridge, where we mobilized for our first Rebellion Week. We got 1,000 people out on O'Connell Bridge. It was great. There was so much fun. We had music on the bridge, speakers, and we held there for a good 6-7 hours. So it was blocking, it was being disruptive, it was gaining attention, but we had to move several times. So we did block both quays as the day progressed, and escalating things a little bit, being disruptive. We climbed O'Connell Monument. You can see that's Patrick, myself, and Louis holding the banners there, calling for declare climate emergency now, which they did 3 weeks later. So some of the other things we've done since, actions are not just meant to be disruptive, they can be creative in other ways. So at Bloom Festival, we had rebels painted up in gold. They got Michael D. Higgins' attention, and he gave us indirect support, featuring us on his social media pages. We had a die-in, which is where everyone drops as if dead, in the Dead Zoo in Dublin. We've had arts, music, culture declaring emergency. This became an international symbol of solidarity for the creative world to support XR and the mission. We've also attended festivals. We got artists such as Blind Boy, Orbital, Groove Armada, Lisa Hannigan back in Electric Picnic to wear patches in support of us and have flags on the stage. We even had the main stage at the picnic showing a trailer for Rebellion Week, urging people to come out, to take time off work in October and come and support us. It was amazing, the level of support. Like, this message really was there in society and being welcomed by so many sectors. So, Rebellion Week 2. We camped out on Merrion Square. We had our own pink boat, which has actually become a symbol of XR actions all over the world. So we hosted a week of actions there. We had a stage for music events. There was constantly workshops, food provided, sign-ups and orientation. We even had a visit from the Lord Mayor, giving his support and criticising politicians for their lack of will. We escalated some efforts, being disruptive. We blockaded the Dáil twice. We kept politicians held up hours into the night. At one stage, 5 rebels locked themselves onto the gates and had to be forcibly cut free and arrested, although let go instantly and welcomed back. So we made media coverage. We put the strategy into action. We were even covered by the BBC in some cases better than the Irish Times. So all this was disruptive. It was done with empathy, with NVDA, nonviolent direct action, at the heart of it. It was embodying nonviolence. There was actually quite a good rapport with the guards too, which there's mixed views on, but overall, it was a very powerful event to be a part of. There was no sense of us and them in terms of disrespect for oppressors. You know, we're working with everyone in society here. So it wasn't like anything of the escalations in the UK. They had over 1,300 arrests at the same time and managed to host another rebellion week just in last September following COVID, with 600 arrests again. So I will speak a little bit about arrest. So it's been a key part of the strategy for XOR. Getting arrested represents a way to build more momentum in the media about this. It's not just getting arrested for the sake of it. It's actually showing that we are taking this to heart. We are acting because we believe this is the way to achieve change. And we are not afraid to stand by that. We're not afraid to challenge parts of the system which are driving these events. Another part of the strategy is that, well, in the UK anyway, they were able to on that level. It can clog up the system. There's only so much arrests the police can do before the public actually sees this as being ridiculous and also hindering their ability to still continue to do it, to arrest people. So at that stage, they actually need to just host conversations to look at the demands, look at why this is happening. Now, this has been a barrier to some minority groups getting involved. That's been a learning curve. So we do really acknowledge that there's been a certain position of privilege in order to be able to disobey the law in this manner. However, we're taking that on board and really looking for ways to work around that. So in Ireland, the police have taken a different approach, very rarely arresting us, maybe not wanting us to give that kind of publicity, who knows. But there's so many ways to get involved. I really don't want to focus in on this as being the prime part of our strategy. For every one person that's willing to be arrested, there's 30, 40, 50 doing many other roles. There's so many groups and factions like XOR families, scientists, doctors. We really have started to get so many aspects of society coming out and representing themselves. It's been amazing to see. So taking all of this on board, what's actually happened in the last few years, we're in a really different position giving this talk now to when we first heard it, because there have been some real signs of change. We've seen the strategy being put into action. So these graphs here, the one below the blue line, this was a YouGov historic poll in the UK, because this was public opinion on concern about how much of an issue climate change is to the public. There was a spike after some flooding in 2014, but then again, right before the initial protests in London, April 2019, then people really started to see this as urgent. And the top bar, this was a study that the UN did just in January of this year. They surveyed 1.2 million people asking, what level do you think of climate change as being a global emergency? And pretty much across the board, 65, 66% was the average, saying that yes, this is urgent. So things are changing. The languages around this has changed, as I've stated. So even like looking at 2050 was often the deadline introduced for policies for change. Now that's shifted to more towards 2030, and in some cases earlier than that. So speaking about where we are now, it has been really difficult to still move forward with the same level of momentum over the last year. COVID's obviously become the attention, and for good reason, but we haven't been able to get out on the streets, we haven't been able to mobilize, we haven't been able to continue that momentum. So we've had to rethink a little bit. Now, they still did their latest rebellion in the UK. And this particular action was using bamboo structures to blockade the news companies. So they stopped newspapers going out in the morning, which really delayed the business as usual. So there still are ways to do it. There's ways to be creative. Saying a little bit about what has been happening then. I won't go into full detail on this. I would urge everyone to find out about CETA as soon as possible and to help in XR and the rest of the environmental's efforts to stop it. CETA stands for the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with Canada, with the EU. And basically it would allow multinational corporations to sue Ireland and any other country for loss of profits. And there have been precedents set, and these lawsuits bypass domestic courts, and they take place before an international tribunal of arbitrators, which is essentially pre-investment lawyers who decide whether private profits or public interests are more important. There's loads of ways to get involved. I will share a link in the chat to one of our recent newsletters, which gave really good information on it. So rebels have been wheat pasting these the signage around Dublin in the last week, which has been great. It's been generating a lot of momentum. And another sister movement, Animal Rebellion, which is taking the same kind of approach but focusing on agriculture, has recently launched and been doing amazing work as well. So we have been active in other ways. So it's been a quiet year, and we have had time over the winter in particular to reflect and learn on what needs to change, what can be updated in our strategy going forward. So we don't have the wave that the new movement had 2 years ago, but some of the thinking that we've been able to implement is changing from some of the initial information that came out. So there was initially talk of 3.5% of the population being a figure that you needed to successfully mobilize and have success in your campaign. That was looked at originally in context with oppressive regimes where the public felt oppressed by the state. We're not in that same context, so it may not apply, but nevertheless, it's a numbers game. We're no longer targeting the public, but we need as many people on board. But this will be a key difference in our strategy, that we're going to be targeting industries rather than blocking roads and traffic. So we'll be rebuilding momentum, yes, as I said, with Stop CETA and with agriculture as that strategy continues to develop. But one of our most recent focuses is cover climate like COVID. So this is going to really target media, trying to get them to actually be in our face with as much information and urgency as we've seen throughout the coronavirus. It's not going to be easy, but we do need that kind of momentum. We need to actually see this as an emergency, and there's, news corporations have huge potential to really change things. So we will keep you posted on that, but there'll be developments coming in the next few months. We're going to escalate efforts largely through physical and digital coordinated actions. We're going to see about physical because obviously restrictions will apply, but digitally we're looking at Twitter storms, thunderclaps, digital rebellion, and there'll be greater synergy with the environmental network as we continue to work together. So moving towards a close, some of the ways to really get involved, to take the next steps, will be on the 14th of March, we'll be having a People's Assembly, a form of organizing, a form of engaging people that's modeling our kind of values, hearing from everyone, mitigating for power, and making sure that everyone has a say in how we go forward. So what we're saying is this will be the meeting of the year in terms of its importance for XR. It'll be participative, and it'll also be proposing some of the thinking that the strategy circle has been progressing over the last number of months. So please share the word, call friends, promote this, come along even if you're new. I think it'll be a really important step that we would love you to be a part of. Another way to get involved is through regional groups. At one stage, these were all really active and all taking on roles for Rebellion Week 2. A lot of them have been quiet lately, although some activities started again, but they'll probably need revitalizing. So you're welcome to take part in actions. You can join or set up a regional group if there isn't already one near you. You can learn to give this talk. You can attend nonviolent direct action training, which will be coming up shortly. We don't have a date yet. But ultimately, please stay informed. There's ways to join the newsletter, follow us on social media, and if you feel motivated, if you feel moved enough, you can help us organize on our Slack channel. So I will move towards a close, speaking a little bit about, again, what it actually means to take this to heart, to be a good ancestor. I've just recently read this book by Roman Krusneric. He's the partner of Kate Raworth, who's the founder of Donut Economics. Donut Economics is a new alternative system being implemented in Amsterdam and several other places. But he's looking at how we can actually think long-term in a short-term world, regardless of how short-term, how we can actually be good ancestors. He speaks about if we could spin the wheel at birth, having any odds to be born anywhere at any time, we would want those odds to be equal to ensure the best opportunities for peace, well-being, and safety. We're currently borrowing time we won't pay back and using up the resources of those ahead of us. In essence, we are rigging the odds for those in the future. We're committing them to something catastrophic, as if it's ours to take from. We're colonizing the future. What we need is to feel true care and empathy for those who aren't even alive yet. We need to extend that empathy across space and time to a future that our ancestors may arrive at. We need to be good ancestors. So, as Martin Luther King has said, it's always time to do the right thing. Taking to heart the information in the first side of this talk, we don't know how bad the situation is. We know it's bad. We don't know how long we have to really reverse things. We don't even know if we really can make the difference that we need. But it is irrelevant when you can really connect to the purpose behind doing the right thing, behind acting however you can. For others, the global south, for the future, for ourselves, for the planet. So I'd like you to just take a moment to read these questions and really try and feel into them. How did they have impact in your life? What would they mean? And I'll close by reading an excerpt from our recent publication. This is not a drill. We hereby declare the bonds of the social contract to be null and void. The government has rendered them invalid by its continuing failure to act appropriately. We call upon every principled and peaceful citizen to rise with us. We refuse to bequeath a dying planet to future generations by failing to act now. We act in peace with a ferocious love of these lands in our hearts. We act on behalf of life. This is an art piece from Banksy following the first Rebellion Week. From this moment, despair ends and tactics begin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. That was wonderful. Really, really moving. Thanks so much. That was really special. Thanks everyone. If you'd like to stay on for some questions, that'd be great. As well, you can leave your email in the chat, and we can send you the newsletter that way. So just if there's any queries, questions you have now, you can put them to our speakers, or if you have none, that's okay as well. But I'll keep you on a minute just to see if there's anything. Caroline, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's not a question. I wanted to ask for support from everybody here. We are Extinction Rebellion Inishowen, and we're having to fight gold mining. There's been an exploration license was given out a few years ago, and they have recently said they found a great vein of gold, and there's great excitement about it. And we know how toxic gold mining is, how absolutely useless it is to even look for gold in the state the world is in. But we need to stop them. There's going to be a new license given out in April by our wonderful Green Minister for Climate. So that's kind of disturbing. And we have a Facebook page called Safe Inishowen from Gold Mining. And on there, on the pinned post, you can send an objection to the renewal of the license. And we would ask people to help us do that. We see things like campaigning against gold mining in the same vein as campaigning against fracking and the LNG gas. And, you know, it's like we need to kind of support each other in those practical environmental battles. So I would love it if you have a look at that page. It's called Safe Inishowen from Gold Mining. And if you can send an objection, that'd be great. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And especially thank you so much for your dedication to stopping environmentally destructive practices. So if there's any questions that have arose for you, even just like how you feel now, or like what should I do, or anything, we're happy to take it.
Breach, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So Aaron touched on the possible actions in the next, few weeks and months. And what I think I heard him say was that because of the pandemic and because of this constant media coverage of numbers, statistics, how it affects us on an international, national, and community levels, on a family level, the media are absolutely prime for taking this type of reporting and translating it into climate reporting. So how has Extinction Rebellion discovered that? How could we, the people at this meeting today, best pressurize our media to make the change from reporting on COVID, hopefully by the end of this year, they won't need to anymore, to reporting on climate with the same ferocity, the same ferociousness?
Aaron, yeah.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, for us, that just seems like a natural direction for our strategy, is to really get that kind of message trending. So actions you can take. Some of us have already written to RT really saying that the coverage is absolutely unacceptable. It's not on par with what we need. Recently, Kieran O'Carroll on Twitter, he asked RT to feature one of the, what are they called, in the taskbar, to actually have a specific climate, words are now failing me, to have somewhere you can click to get all the recent climate updates, just like there is with COVID.
Yes, exactly.
But ultimately, we'll be trying to trend the hashtag cover climate like COVID in the coming months, and really
brilliant. That's what I was looking for
around this.
Thank you. Yeah.
Patrick, I think, wants to add.
Yeah, I'd say I just also add that really just by becoming involved, like in terms of how we actually get media to convey this message, when we get active together and when we have actions, we give the media something to report on. So like back in Rebellion Week, many of us were doing interviews all the time, or so it seemed. So that's, we're giving the media something to work with. Essentially, we also want them to work and find ways to produce. But by being active, we generate we generate momentum, and that's even visible now in the Stop CETA campaign. Is like, that's what would I say? It's made a swell of activism again, people engaging, and because of that, then that's generating media. So I think, like as Aaron said, like if you subscribe to the newsletter, that is one way to plug in and channel some of this drive and the care and protection of the planet, is to, even just selecting a campaign like that, getting active, and then media is generated from that.
Excuse me, Momo, could you please mute? Thank you. We are always open to ideas. We are always trying to organize. And if you go on Slack, if you have any ideas at all, we love them. Like, we appreciate them so much. And people in Extinction Rebellion show up. I've organized things. I've gone to things and like had strangers like help me in like really special ways. Like I started a garden with like a large group of people, so that like there is always room to do more, and that's why we do these talks. If there's anything else anyone would like to ask.
Go ahead, Linda. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Hello. Patrick, I think you were saying that there's been a 0.75% reduction in flying insects. Over what time span was that?
That report came out in 2017, I think, and that was over a 25-year time span.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, I'd also like to introduce Mel as well, and an idea, because one thing we were really considering is that this talk can leave people feeling rattled after, and any of us can feel rattled. So we speak of, oh, actually, I'll let Mel say all of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah. So yeah, just as a follow-up to this call, really, we're going to, on Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, we're going to have a open sharing space. It'll be a held space for you or anybody who wants to attend to really share what's alive for you, anything that's kind of come up from this call, or in relation to the climate crisis in general, anything that you feel like you need to talk about. There'll be a space that we can kind of come together and do that. It's also a space we can just come to connect to each other, even if you've got nothing really that feels burning alive, and maybe you knew all this before and you're not feeling anything, but that's fine too. You know, a place for us just to come together and reconnect, and, you know, get to chat and make some human connections, which, like Patrick and Aaron were both saying, I mean, a lot of the energy in the movement comes from the fact that people feel so aligned with each other and do actually make these very human connections. And as Aaron was saying too, regenerative culture is a huge part of the movement, and looking after each other. You know, just so, as much as anything else, it's a way to just check in with each other and say, you know, how are you after having this experience, hearing the true impacts of what's going on with the climate crisis and everything else that's happening in the world. And, you know, we are all very isolated, and we'd hate to be thinking that, you know, we're just sending everybody off to their own spaces and not have a place where they can kind of come and say, you know, actually, I feel really shit, or after hearing that, you know, that was really intense. And I think a lot of us have gone through very intense times, and we do, it's very natural. I know when I first kind of really realized the true impacts of the climate crisis, I was just, you know, breaking down in tears in public places just randomly. And yeah, so anyway, Sunday at 4 o'clock, it will be a held shared space for anybody to share anything, and or even just to connect, whichever you need to do. So, and on Zoom, obviously, we'll send the link in the follow-up emails to everybody. We should have everybody's emails. So that's really the next thing that we invite you to come to. I'm just going to repeat again what Aaron said about the People's Assembly on the 14th of March, which the only thing he didn't mention is that it is on Zoom. It's not like you don't have to turn up face to face. Yeah. So that was, people have been saying as well, you know, how can we get involved? How can we do more? That is also a place to find out really what can we do, because that's when all XR members together, I think, are going to be shaping what do we do next. So to be part of shaping that, shaping the next steps, come along to that. So thank you.
Do we have any more questions before we wrap things up?
Could I just say, if anyone hasn't left their email address, could they just leave it there now, please? And we'll contact you. We'll put you on the mailing list for the newsletter for start. And anyone who wants to become more involved, then you can contact us through that email. And also, we have a forum on, it's called Slack. You can contact us, we email you this, and you can get more involved. It's also, as was mentioned during the group, there's, you know, you can start your own group in your locality, and if you want information on doing stuff like that, we can get that to you. So again, if you can share your email address, and we can contact you, and then you can contact us again. Or you can contact us on Facebook, I think, or Twitter, or the usual social media routes. That's it for me. That's just the technical side of things.
Yeah, if you don't want to put your email into the chat, you can, for everyone, you can just send it to me, and it'll be confidential. We'll put it in that document. for the newsletter. Thanks everyone so much for coming. You can throw your emails in, and Marie is going to give us sort of going to finish us off, I suppose.
I hope we're going to finish off metaphorically, not literally. But just to say thank you so much for everybody who's participated, Alan and Patrick and Eugene and Hilary for doing a great job yet again. Just want to share this because this is a solemn declaration that we make in exile when we gather together, for action, when we gather together to actually connect with that heart piece to know what we should be doing and where we should be going. So I just invite you to just sort of sit back and maybe listen to this. Let us take a moment, this moment, to consider why we're here. Let's recall our love for humanity in all corners of the world. Let's remember our love for this beautiful planet that feeds, nourishes, and sustains all life. Let's recollect our sincere desire to protect all this for now and for generations to come. As we act today, may we find the courage to bring this sense of peace and appreciation to everyone we encounter, to every word we speak, and to every action we make. In this emergency, together, rooted in love, we are all we need.
Thanks so much everyone for coming, and thank you so much to Marie, Louis, Aaron, Mel and Patrick. You did an amazing job, folks. Have a great evening.
And you, Regine.
Thank you, Regine.
Yeah. Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Hope to see you again.